The year is 1987. The video game world is about to be hit by some of its greatest titles, such as Zelda 1 or 2 depending on where you are in the world, Metal Gear, Contra, and even Mega Man. However, for a little company known as Square, things aren't looking too well, and they face bankruptcy. But seeing what their rival company Enix has just recently done, they're ready to pull out a risky move. How final would this move be, and where would it take the company from there? And this is what I'll be bringing into discussion today at the GameSpace. I'm Joshua Harlock Adam, and today I'll be talking with you about one of my most favorite series, Final Fantasy, and how it came to be, and debunk one of its biggest urban legends. After seeing the success of their rival company Enix's game Dragon Quest, current president of Square, Hironobu Sakaguchi, saw fit that his idea could very well be what they're looking for. When he started the project, he wanted the abbreviation to sound almost soothing to the ear, so he chose FF. Now at first he wanted the abbreviation to stand for Fighting Fantasy, but unfortunately, that name was already taken by a board game at the time. Now this is where the urban legend, Final and Final Fantasy, is meant to be their last stand. This was debunked though by Sakaguchi himself during a talk where he was discussing RPG games, and I quote, "There's an urban legend that the Final and Final Fantasy meant that this was our last project. While we were having some hard times back then, the truth is that as long as this title could be shortened to FF, any word would have sufficed. Development for Final Fantasy would not start until Sakaguchi could see for himself and prove that the RPG genre would thrive in the market. After seeing the success of Dragon Quest, he was determined to create the project that he wanted to make next. The development team only consisted of 4 people, not including Sakaguchi himself. Staff consisted of Akito Kawazu, Hiroyuki Ito, Nasir Gabelli, and Nobuo Uematsu. Apologies in advance for any mispronunciations. It was Ito and Kawazu who designed the battle system, both of which had not worked on any previous RPGs before. Same can be said for Gabelli, being the solo programmer of the team. As a solo developer myself, I can relate to how this went. Being a solo dev on any project that you don't understand can be quite the handful. And last but certainly not least is Nobuo Uematsu with his compositions that made the series quite famous indeed. When the battle system was designed, there was some heavy inspiration from professional sports as well as Dungeons and Dragons. I'll save the talk about Dungeons and Dragons for another time though, but meanwhile, Ito took inspiration from American football, where at the beginning of the game both teams are lined up in front of each other. Whereas Kawazu took quite a bit of inspiration from Dungeons and Dragons, mainly the bestiary as well as the magic system. The reason D&D was looked into so heavily was because of how Kawazu felt character creation is the beginning of all RPGs and it should be the most fun, which is why you're not limited in party creation. If you wanted a team full of all white mages, go ahead. The old fighters, that's fine too. Imbalance didn't matter to them as long as it was fun and the player could figure out their own way of dealing with any situation thrown at them. One last thing that was inspired by D&D was the changes in environmental type as well as enemy weakness and elemental weaknesses, such as zombies being weak to fire and how fire can also melt ice. Adaptations like this weren't heard of back then in RPGs, so this made Final Fantasy really stand out in the West. Square had projected to sell around 200,000 copies. However, Sakaguchi felt that he could sell well over 500,000 copies instead. When it came down to it, he took a ROM to every single publication he could, just to take the public relations into his own hands. This proved successful, as now Final Fantasy is considered the second most influential RPG in the early console era, second only to Dragon Quest, the game of their rival company. The game was critically acclaimed for the battle animations that it had being the best that anyone's ever seen, as well as the musical compositions and how memorable they will become later on. As a matter of fact, I've used some samples from the soundtrack throughout the video. The game is even so well received that throughout gaming history it's received several different ports up until this current day and age, such as platforms from the NES to the PlayStation to current day with smartphone releases, each iteration adding their own unique tweaks and fixes. Sakaguchi was able to hit his goal, achieving over 600,000 sales in Japan alone during the initial release of Final Fantasy, and he hit it again later on in America with 700,000 only a few years later. It can be said that Final Fantasy is still being praised as one of the flagship titles for early RPGs. It also stands to prove that it did save the company and prevented it from being their final fantasy. Thanks again for tuning in to me discussing Final Fantasy and sort of celebrating it for not only saving a company but for starting a trend in RPGs. Today's episode was packed full of information, but it actually gets me excited to talk about Dragon Quest as well as Dungeons and Dragons and how it affected a few games in the past. As always, feel free to keep the conversation going in the comment section down below. Leave a like, subscribe if you can, it helps the channel tremendously. And I'll see you in the next discussion.